The United Kingdom has the third largest aviation industry in the world, and it's due to get bigger, a lot bigger. In November 2001, Stephen Byers, then Transport Secretary, announced the conclusion to what had been the longest public inquiry in British history.
Mr. Speaker, after considering the inspector's report and taking into account all the relevant considerations, I have today given my approval to the development of Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport.
At a cost of more than £4 billion to the public purse, Terminal 5 was given the go-ahead, but with strict conditions.
What we have today, and this is very important, I think, for people living nearby, is that we are actually making it a planning condition that there will be a limit of 480,000 flight movements a year. That means that it cannot be changed, even by my successor.
We have built the fourth largest economy in the world on our ability to trade. Air travel is crucial to our expanding economy, and we need to plan for the future.
So within a few short months, the new Transport Secretary, Alistair Darling, announced a new consultation document, the future development of air transport in the UK. This time, it wasn't just about Heathrow. There were proposed options for more than 40 new or expanding airports. But it was expansion that not everyone wanted.
The Secretary of State should be aware of the sense of betrayal and anger and real worry amongst my constituents who live near Heathrow. Betrayal and anger because at Terminal 4 inquiry we were told there'd be no need for Terminal 5. At Terminal 5, the British Airports Authority wrote to every one of my constituents at Heathrow saying there was no need for a third runway. 6 months ago, the Secretary of State told me my environment of my constituents would be protected by a cap on Heathrow. And now they're coming back for more, and they will not
be able to live with the pollution level, even if we couldn't lose our homes.
I've lived in my house for 48 years, and I think I'm entitled to live in it till I die.
So Heathrow's appetite for growth continued, the government putting aside health concerns, stating that as it was in the national interest, local residents would have to live with the negative impact. The method used for measuring aircraft noise has always been disputable. Along with the sound peaks, the quieter periods in between are also measured, giving an average sound level. One example is Concorde. It peaks at more than 100 decibels, but as it takes off only once a day, it's measured as being well below the annoyance threshold, or so they say.
We do find that the teachers continually have to stop their lessons. We're constantly disrupted, and that obviously affects the flow of teaching.
I mean, this morning I was playing a game with the children and we had to stop, and because of the noise, and the children, you know, they get distracted, so it's difficult to keep them on task.
Communities around all airports are already experiencing huge levels of noise. Third runways further expanding will make things worse as far as noise, pollution and danger is concerned.
And of course it's very easy just to say aircraft noise, live near an airport, don't want it. The health impacts of aircraft noise are what really matter. British Airways ran an ad campaign last year that said, fly with us, we'll let you sleep on a bed. Well, that would be something that the people who live around Heathrow would like to do, quite frankly.
Around 1 million people are now living under the Heathrow flight path. Another major problem for them, night flights. It was left to local pressure groups to challenge their very legality.
The European Court of Human Rights decided in October of 2001 that everybody had a right to 8 hours sleep at night, uninterrupted by aircraft noise. And we were thrilled. The whole world was sending us emails here and telephone messages and letters, because it meant that that was a precedent that they could use for themselves.
But their success was to be short-lived when the government appealed.
It's not a case of banning night flights overnight. It would be a case of instituting a proper study into the effects of night flights and introducing a new regime. But I think that the human rights case shows that people are prepared to take governments to court when they continually break promises over the way in which they're calling airports and airlines to account. I think the next big case that's likely in a few years' time, if government gives approval for more expansion at some of these airports, but particularly Heathrow, will be on air quality, because air quality breaches are already happening in the UK, and particularly in West London, and they're going to get worse if there's a third runway at Heathrow.
So night flights at Heathrow go on. Flights which local residents describe as a sky of sound descending upon them loud enough to raise the dead. And that's exactly what they'd intended to do.
I'm here today because I'm fighting for my dear daughter. She's buried in St Mary's, Harmondsworth. Blair and the Civil Aviation want to bulldoze St Mary's and dig up the dead and take them elsewhere in the country. And I'm saying those bodies are there to stay.
I wrote to the Prime Minister himself as a fellow Christian, and I got a standard sort of response saying this is the responsibility of the Department of Transport, and we've passed your letter on. And quite frankly, I'm horrified that a fellow Christian could do such a thing to another one.
But it wasn't just about the airport. There was also the added infrastructure and roads. Heathrow already generates 45,000 car journeys a day, and when these emissions are mixed with those from the airport and the planes, they can combine to make a lethal cocktail.
If you live near an airport, you're more likely to have children with asthma. The pollution levels from aircraft and from all the traffic going to and from an airport increases air pollution and contributes to the asthma problem in school children. We know from American studies in Chicago that what aviation does is actually contribute to raised incidence of cancer. The actual causal process is very complicated, but the evidence is clear from the Environmental Protection Agency in America that there's a raised incidence of cancer near airports. And this leads to the conclusion that airports really should be regarded in much the same way as large industrial plants. An airport, at the end of the day, is only a very large chemical factory. It's like a cross between an industrial estate, a jammed up motorway junction and a chemical factory. It's a large, dirty industrial plant with all the health problems that result from that.
24,000 people in the UK died prematurely directly as a result of poor air quality. If you're interested in those issues and they concern you as a government, then you can't blithely go ahead and just continue to expand airports.
With a flight now arriving in Heathrow every 90 seconds, it was the aircraft emissions that were causing the greatest concern.
Besides the obvious local impacts of losing habitats, losing listed buildings, more and more road traffic, more and more noise and pollution from aircraft, the big strategic problem that air transport has is climate change. There's a growing and worrying contribution from aircraft emissions to climate change. It's the big issue anyway in environmental terms for the 21st century. Independent, respected organisations like the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tell us that there's a big problem from aircraft emissions, which are, let's face it, injected as a result of our addiction to air travel directly into the atmosphere at sensitive levels in the stratosphere.
And if we do that kind of damage to the global climate, it's irreversible. Expanding the Sahara, it won't come back. What we're looking at really is a crisis in our life in the biosphere. Some people say, well, we have an environmental crisis. No, the environment has a human crisis, and flying is a large part of that.
The ambitions for Heathrow are dwarfed alongside the government's proposed option for an extra 3 runways at Stansted. It would turn it into the world's largest airport. It would also mean the loss of thousands of acres of countryside and ancient woodland, not to mention the hundreds of homes and listed buildings which would have to be destroyed.
Well, the house is 400 years old. It was originally 2 cottages, now into 1 house. We've lived in it for 31 of those years, and we've been incredibly happy here, and we'll be absolutely heartbroken if anything happens to it. Well, it is listed, which does mean that we can't do anything to it. without going to government for permission, not even change the colour of the paint on the windows, but some other little person can come along and just knock it flat without any permission apparently being required.
And even while the fight against future development goes on, there's already a sense here of creeping airline intrusion.
The summer's probably the biggest problem. Takeoff is really, really awful. As I said to you before, we've counted about 15 seconds apart in July and August. And night time, the flight's beginning to creep into the night time too now.
Do you get noise at night? Can you hear the planes at night? Hands up if you can hear the planes at night.
It's very interesting now when something of the scale that is suggested by the government is put forward, that people say, no, we might have put up with a certain amount, but this we cannot accept.
If expansion goes ahead at Stansted, its capacity will rise to 129 million passengers a year. Planes will take off or land every 30 seconds during the day, every 3 minutes throughout the night. There would also be a 7-fold increase in the amount of road traffic using the airport. The ambitions of the aviation industry have galvanised opposition from around Britain. Campaigners descended upon Westminster in a show of national unity. This was no longer about individual local issues. The need to fight back had taken on a wider aspect.
And it isn't just a question of NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. These issues don't just affect the people who live in the vicinity of airports. They affect all of us. Climate change is the big environmental issue of the 21st century. And what we all have to do is really to begin to fight a war against climate change and almost adopt the Second World War mantra, is your journey really necessary?
The emissions from aircraft produce those contrails, the white fluffy things that aircraft leave behind when you've got a blue sky. And they form cirrus clouds, a particular kind of cloud, and that adds to what some people call the tea cosy effect, adding to the warming up of the Earth's surface.
After the terrorist atrocities of September the 11th, all US aircraft were grounded for 3 days. During this period, the temperatures recorded at 4,000 weather stations across North America revealed warmer days and colder nights than usual for that time of year. This was due to the absence of condensation trails.
These happen because aircraft fly through levels in the atmosphere which are supersaturated with water vapour. So the particles, things like soot particles, which come out of the engines of the aircraft, cause small nuclei that cause the water vapour to condense out as ice crystals. So when you see an aircraft flying across the sky on a clear day, and it leaves that trail behind it, what you're seeing is very small particles of ice which have formed in the wake of the aircraft.
The option of constructing the biggest airport ever built in Europe, more than twice the size of Heathrow, was what the government had proposed for the people of Cliff. But along with the destruction of 2 villages and thousands of acres of greenbelt land, there were other concerns, some of them stretching far beyond the Kent countryside.
This is one of the last areas in the country where malaria was endemic. The mosquito that we have in these parts, with the quite large numbers of these mosquitoes on the Hoop Peninsula, on the marshes, can carry the malaria bug that causes the disease. The government is already beginning to make contingency plans for malaria to break out again in this country as we have global warming. If you put 130 million travellers passing through an airport where the mosquitoes can carry malaria, some of those travellers will have malaria without knowing it.
This is unnecessary. This form of predict and provide in terms of airport is a fool's game. The airline industry has a completely unassuageable demand, profit-driven, of course, and you simply cannot operate either an environmental or transport policy on that basis.
At the moment we live in Cliff and we can't sell our houses, people are having trouble with jobs that are estate agents and things, so people aren't buying and selling. And we're all worried about our schools and We just want to get on with our lives and say no.
We don't want any airport here.
At the moment we're seeing an increase in mental health problems. We've increased our prescribing of anxiolytic and antidepressant drugs, which we preferred not to do, but we haven't got an option because people are very stressed. If the airport goes ahead, not only will we see an increase in mental health problems, but we'll also see an increase in hearing problems and also those due to pollution such as asthma.
Also under threat was one of Europe's premier wildlife sites and the home to hundreds of thousands of wild fowl, breeding and migratory birds.
People in Kent have been watching this place develop over recent years, and it's become a real treasure, and it would be devastating to lose it.
We've been coming down here for a number of years, and I think one of the really sad things is that a lot of the area is a protected area, and I think it's a real shame that the government can protect places and then just wipe it out because they feel like it.
There's an arrogance that ought to alarm us. There's a greed that ought to goad us to get up and say enough's enough. It's time that we took account of the true cost that these proposals are envisaging. Somebody somewhere has to pay the price.
We in Britain contribute to aviation unwillingly, nobody ever asked us, to the tune of about £10 billion a year. Subsidy. We subsidise aviation. Every man, woman and child in Britain pays about £550 to keep the aviation industry afloat. It's an uneconomic, unviable industry that damages the economy, damages health, damages the environment, damages the planet, and plans to do a lot more of that in the future.
The question of who wins and who loses is really what this is about. The air transport industry is determined to win. It thinks its lobbying powers, it thinks its government relations advisors, it thinks its whole machinery is guaranteed a win, and there will be 4 or 5 new airports the size of Heathrow today up and down the United Kingdom.
The people of Rugby were also well aware of the problems associated with the aviation industry and of the blight a new airport would bring.
It's got the community very, very angry and also very fearful, because they know what has happened in other parts of the country as airports have expanded. They don't want to see that here. They've come here for a certain quality of life. They're entitled to it and they want to keep it.
We don't need to concrete the countryside, we need the countryside. They've got enough concrete everywhere else.
And the blight on our properties is already happening.
No to the airport!
Say no to the airport, exactly. Not here, not anywhere.
The proposed option of what would, again, be one of the world's largest airports to be built on thousands of acres of greenbelt land had, for many residents, flown right out of the blue.
It has been 4 years in the planning, and only in the last 2 months have the government surprised us with this proposal at the end of July. They have given us no time.
They've been very underhand about it. I think it's, in a democracy, people shouldn't be bulldozed into things like this.
I think the public are less and less willing to accept the legitimacy of decisions that are taken on their behalf by a closed community of experts. Whether those experts are scientists or politicians or industrialists, I don't think they trust them enough to delegate that to them and say, well, you're going to take that decision on our or in our interests. They're suspicious, they think that there's vested interest, they think that there's much more uncertainty often than especially politicians claim.
I'd like them to come and live round here though when they do the airport. In fact, I think we'll try and reserve a few houses for those ministers. What do you think?
The one thing I did learn during my 18 months as aviation minister was that the demands of the aviation industry are insatiable. They want more of everything. They want more terminals, more runways, and as soon as they've got one, they go on to start demanding another. They often give assurances which are repeatedly, if not reneged upon, they're forgotten about fairly quickly. And historically governments have tended to give in to them, and I regret that.
I was at the very beginning of a legislative process. I was simply responding on behalf of the European Parliament to some very early ideas from the Commission about how you might try to address the environmental impacts of aviation. But even though my report was right at the beginning of this process, I was lobbied to death by the aviation industry. I had Pratt & Whitney engines, I had DHL, that depends on getting widgets from A to B at, knockdown prices in very old aircraft. just, you know, my door was never empty of people knocking on it to say, you know, please don't do a radical report. What's more than that, what they actually did, the aviation industry, they took hold of my report, they went through it and put where they thought I got it wrong, they suggested amendments, they crossed out bits, and then they helpfully circulated that document to many of my MEP colleagues saying, you know, perhaps you would like to put these amendments through. So if they give that amount of time and scrutiny at such an early stage of the legislative process, you know, we really do have a fight on our hands.
I mean, one of the real concerns is, and one expressed by very many people, are the two closer links between the present government and the various lobbying groups on behalf of the various airline and airport companies. And the answer is, frankly, we don't know.
In November 2002, the government found themselves in the courts again, and again they were to lose.
Given the High Court's decision that the government's consultation is indeed irrational and unjust, will the Prime Minister now clarify for my constituents and for this House why it was that his transport ministers specifically overrode the advice that they were given, which was that they should include Gatwick in the first place? That was the advice. Why did they ignore it?
The reason why we excluded Gatwick was because we'd given an undertaking to exclude Gatwick. Now, the court hearing yesterday has found that in any event, despite that, we should nonetheless include Gatwick. The Secretary of State for Transport has said that that will be done, and that is, of course, right.
They decided last July that Gatwick wasn't a good place to put a runway because the site's too small, it would make an inefficient airport, it would do huge environmental damage, and it would be contrary to a legal agreement which rules out any runway before 2019.
They changed the name of Charwood to runway number 2, 'cause there's no one gives a bugger for the likes of me and you. But the team will be forgotten, as you will surely see, when they change the name of Crawley to runway number 3.
With the consultation document in disarray and with so much opposition, what alternatives were there?
We would agree with the Department of Transport that doing nothing is not an option. But where we would not agree is what needs to be done. Doing nothing about airport capacity actually is an option. But the option which needs to be followed is doing something about the railways instead.
More generally, I'm very interested in what I'm told applies in Finland, where they actually have a joint transport and telecommunications department, recognising that as technology advances, many of the trips that are made certainly for business purposes to bring people together in order to discuss matters between clients and customers is actually something which increasingly can be done through video conferencing and email and other mechanisms.
Rather than endlessly bolting on capacity to existing inland airports, to look very seriously at the option of a new coastal airport, as other countries which have that option are doing.
One of the problems of the southeast of England is there is a limited amount of open space that has no complications whatsoever and wants an airport. As if you find such a site, then you could drop me a note, I'll be interested to find it.
A new airport has never been built in the UK. They've always been developed from existing airfields or aerodromes, as permission to use existing runways is easier to obtain than permission to construct new ones. But the proposal for an offshore airport, to be built on an artificial island in the Thames estuary, did have support from communities throughout the country.
We're continuing along the same old lines of patch and mend, incremental development, whereas we believe there should have been a visionary approach. We should have raised our sights, and in our view, Marinair fits that bill. It is a visionary approach. It's designed to solve the problem of runway capacity in the southeast, solve it without call on the public purse, and solve it without with minimal environmental impact.
The Marinair project ensured all takeoffs and landings were over water. It's not only safer, it virtually eliminates noise pollution. And with the entire construction, including associated rail, road and infrastructure, being privately funded, campaigners questioned why this proposal wasn't even included in the consultation document.
I think perhaps the biggest problem we have to combat is that there is a general feeling that this is too good to be true, and that the money doesn't exist, that we don't exist. But the truth of the matter is that the Marinair project is real. The funding is real. The environmental benefits are real. The flexibility is real. Our difficulty is convincing government and others of this fact.
And communities all over Britain were faced with the same problem: how to convince the government not where to expand, but whether to expand at all.